Hello, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. In our last episode, we saw two sides of Brian, one that was still being an effective businessman, and the other side of him that was him being drugged down by his drug use. He wasn't available to answer important questions regarding the business, and it led him to almost losing one of his most important artists to him, Cilla Black. They were able to settle things when Brian expressed his emotions towards Cilla, and she forgave him. Brian got a countryside home to help him relax and put his signature on a full-page advertisement for letting marijuana be legal. He admitted to taking LSD, and he said it made him feel less bad-tempered. And Lionel Bart said it also took away his necessity to compete, and that was bad for a businessman. So let's see what's going on today. The Beatles' contract with EMI, which had expired in mid-1966, was re-signed by Brian January 27, 1967. Traveling to EMI's Manchester Square, London office in his chauffeur Bentley, Brian had Jeffrey Ellis by his side, and he had a moment of self-satisfaction. He said, "It does give me a great deal of pleasure to arrive here like this, being ushered into the boardroom as opposed to a few years ago when I was crawling around the record companies trying to see an A&R man to get the tapes played." The new deal for the Beatles was unique, giving the Beatles 10% of the retail price of their records, double the normal royalty. At that time, it was the highest royalty given to any artist. A lot of people criticized his soft attitudes on business, and Brian had patiently worked out a remarkable deal that would serve the Beatles well long after his death. At his insistence, they were only obligated to produce 5 or 6 albums in a 9-year duration of their contract. At the end of the first 4 years of the contract, they would not need to produce any records. They would be condensed into less than half the contract's life. So EMI's Lynn Wood felt that the way Brian had made up the contract showed that Brian had vision and disproved his theory that he could not regain his business mettle. For Brian, it was like going back to 1962. Nothing mattered more than the Beatles' future. While he wanted a 9-year link to EMI, Brian said, "How do I know in 8 or 9 years the boys will still want to record? But certainly they'll produce the minimum they are required to do within 4 years, and there will be another 5 years in the contract where they don't have to produce anything, but at least you know they won't produce anything for anybody else." Wood was worried that they could also produce those 70 sides in 1 year, and then I've had it, he said. Epstein said that was unlikely. They're not prepared to sign anything that commits them to going on working in the recording field after 4 years. What they are prepared to say to you is that whatever happens, they won't record for anybody else for 9 years. No other contract had been requested with such an exclusion clause, and to Epstein it was clear the issue was a deal-breaker. Although the Beatles split in 1970, the contract proved valuable to EMI. Their solo work was considerable right through the 4 years. For Epstein, that EMI deal was a triumphant beginning to what would be 8 months of problems ending in his death. Larry Parnes said the more successful he got, the more lonely he became. He bought the Seville for something to do in the evenings because not a lot of work except for a business dinner takes place if your artists are not working, and the evenings are the worst time. He was a sensitive person who bottled up his emotions, but all his success and money in the world could not make up for his loneliness. Brian said in an interview to Melody Maker that the wish to be a family man was slightly unrealistic and unlikely to be fulfilled, but it's one of the biggest disappointments to me because must be missing out on somewhere, not having a wife and children. I would love to have children. On his visits to Liverpool, Brian doted on his niece Joanne, born to his brother Clive and his wife Barbara, on October 24, 1964. Brian had his family and relatives and his second family which stemmed from his work. He had few friends. He needed friends more than most because of his background. John Lyndon said that there was a lot of loneliness and searching in him. There was a gut emptiness. He searched and searched outside for something to fill it, but never ever could. Mike Berry, a disc jockey, said that Brian invented the Scotch and Coke as a drink combination, which the Beatles later took up. He was quite a heavy drinker, but you never really noticed. I always found him very lonely. He was very frightened of being who he was, very shy. It was easy to embarrass him. He'd be more frightened of meeting somebody than they were of meeting him. He would go from the Cromwellian and move on to the St. James Club. He never left alone, according to his drinking companions. He would take the companions with him in a chauffeur Bentley, and Brian's nighttime wanderings around London worried them all. They felt he liked to find companions who neither knew or cared about his identity. Of all the people who came to London with him, Brian found the most comfort from Jerry Marsden. Jerry was happy, positive, and soft-hearted, and he remained a gritty Liverpudlian, disinterested in the drug culture that attracted Brian and the Beatles. Jerry was a workaholic and would get impatient with Brian's excesses. Jerry said he'd ring me at ridiculous times, 4 and 5 in the morning, asking me to go round to his home, which I did, to talk him out of his terrible depression. He was a lonely guy. He didn't have many friends except us, the bands, and Cilla, and we were working lots of times when he maybe needed company. Sometimes he'd ring and we'd say, "Sorry, Brian, we're knackered." He had a nightly cycle of a solitary man. He would alternate between the seedy clubs of London's Dockland and the Old Kent Road, or in the ritzy gambling clubs of Mayfair. Paddy Chambers, a guest one weekend at Brian's home in Sussex, saw his friend looking sad. The carefree and happy Eppie that he had known had deteriorated. There was something on his mind. He bought his luxury home, but money couldn't buy him happiness. Tito Burns said the change in Brian within the last couple of months was a terrible thing to see. Whereas before he was nearly always smiling and looked rosy, he suddenly was nothing like that. Burns tried to warn Brian on the downward spiral he was on. He would say to Brian, "Brian, did you read about so-and-so? Killed himself on drugs. What a smuck." He had his life in front of him. He didn't listen. Johnny Gustafson said Brian never seemed to have any close friends like we all did. I noticed that any men we saw him with, we would never see him with them again. Generally, it was the wrong period for that man. He was too naive. He learned about life in general later than the bands did. The musicians were very down to earth. We learned how to cope with the world partly through the Hamburg scene. But Brian had no grounding. He stepped right into the deep end and was sucked into the whirlpool of drugs. And he had neither the experience to know how to escape from it, nor the stamina to do anything about it. It was very sad and really upset me. For all his pressures, Brian still had flashes of insight and decisive actions, but he felt exposed when he went to Nim's offices in London, alienated from his own company by Stigwood's self-serving bustle and Lewis's conflicting personality. Now he didn't like going to his company headquarters in Argyle Street because he didn't enjoy what he saw there. There were only 2 people who understood him, and that was his mother Queenie and Nat Weiss. Queenie was compassionate and showed her concern about his loneliness and rootlessness. Nat, on the phone from New York most days, would tolerate none of Epstein's tantrums, but he had a telepathic reading of his best friend's thoughts, and Brian liked his strengths. In the spring of 1967, he made a business link with Weiss, and to ensure that nobody at NIMS could strengthen a grip on the company by appointing American representation of his or her choice. Inside his suite at New York's Waldorf Towers, Brian began talking to Nat about improving their association. "We have 3 choices. Either we could be involved together legally and work together, which means you would handle the boys with me in America and Canada, or you could do whatever you want to do and I'd be glad to help you, or we stay friends, whatever you like." Weiss said he was flattered, at which point Brian pressed a bell and an aide came in with a contract for Weiss to sign. Brian said, smiling, "I thought she'd say that." It was a 3-year pact signed May the 16th, 1967, gave Nemperer Artists in New York exclusive representation of all NIMS artists in the United States and Canada. For a first year's payment of $1,000 a week, Nemperer became the United States and Canadian office at NIMS. The significance of the deal went unheralded and largely unnoticed by Brian's colleagues, but it made the formal binding of the 2 companies more resolute than most recognized, making Weiss Brian's official American representative. And Brian acted just in time. A day after signing of the agreement, his doctor suggested he enter the Priory Hospital in Roehampton for a complete rest. Brian was lucky because he was able to leave the Priory frequently, and this meant that nobody outside his right circle of friends and colleagues knew he was having hospital treatments. 2 days after his admission on May 19th, he hosted at Chapel Street the launching party for the Beatles' new album, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. All 4 Beatles were there, with a small gathering of media people. Brian was quieter than usual, but he circulated smoothly among his guests. Brian made sure there was fine champagne, vintage wines, glazed poached salmon, and caviar. The music was different than the Beatles had done before, and it started a new era in popular music. When the author of the book was taking out a notebook to write down some comments by John Lennon, Brian moved in immediately to ensure that nothing controversial was being reported. While Brian was at the Priory, he was played a tape of the new album, and he was immensely proud of the Beatles' major leap into mature music. Despite his condition, Brian seemed enthusiastic about extending his management functions. Brian had other outings from Priory during his 9-day treatment. He had done the Pepper Party, and he hosted lunch for his parents at Chapel Street, and then went back to the clinic. Brian seemed to be stimulated by life itself, and he wrote to Nat Weiss, "I'm really sure this place is doing me a lot of good. For the first time really in 6 years, I'm having some rest and feeling completely some peace. Of course, I've not been completely bound to the place. On Saturday, I went to tea and to spend a few hours at Ringo's, where John, Sim, Julian, and George all showed up, and that was really nice. Last Friday evening, I hosted the press party for the boys at my house. This went very well. The photography session in my drawing room verged on an American press conference scene, as I did some holding my breath as everyone bounced around my antiques, and all seemed pleased. I hope the house in Sussex will be ready for a shortish convalescence when I leave here, which should be about next Sunday or so. Well, Nat, it's a bright, sunny, beautiful morning, 6:30 a.m., and I can hear the early jets coming in. I'm thinking of you all." So I will end the video here. The next video will be the conclusion of the book, The Man Who Made the Beatles. And this book has been so eye-opening because we get to see the man Brian Epstein was and how he and the Beatles got together and all that Brian did to get the Beatles the success they were looking for, and Brian wanted that for them too. In this episode, we saw that even though Brian was dealing with health issues caused by his drug use, he was still able to make good business moves, and he got Jeffrey Ellis to handle the American company, Nemperor. He handled the press party for the Beatles' new album, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and hearing the album in the clinic, he was very proud of their new sound of music and the music field. And I'm glad that Jerry Marsden was such a good friend to Brian. He was there to handle late-night phone calls and go to Brian when he was depressed. He also had his mom, Queenie, who knew him like no one else did, and also his friend and business partner, Jeffrey Ellis, who wouldn't put up with his tantrums, and he seemed to have telepathic thoughts on what Brian was thinking. Well, I hope everybody enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would be greatly appreciated, and it'll help my channel to keep growing. And as I've mentioned before, I created a list of merchandise from Amazon that I thought you might be interested in, and if you click on the link, it takes you to the Amazon page. And if you purchase anything, I get a small commission that is of no extra cost to you. But more importantly, I want to wish everyone a good day, and tune in again soon for another episode of the Beatles Forever. Thank you. Bye.